Hello everyone. This video is for everyone, whether you are living with brain injury or you care about someone living with brain injury. The Brain Injury Society of Toronto, or BIST Advocacy Committee, heard from the community that even some practitioners aren't aware of all of the options that someone can apply for. We created this document because we wanted to collect as many of those resources as possible into one document for funding, government programs and rebates, safe, affordable, supportive, and assisted housing options. So it's quite large. It's about 46 pages long, which is why this video will give you an idea of where to look for things and how to follow it. Now, although this document was written to be tailored for brain injury, please note that anyone with disability or low income or experiencing homelessness or living with other significant factors such as mental health, justice system experience, addiction, and things like that will also find resources helpful in this document. So this is called the Process Map for Practitioners and Individuals Seeking Housing in Toronto After Brain Injury. The reason we called it a process map is because it does include step-by-step instruction for finding housing in Toronto. And so we wanted to make sure that everyday people would know what the important steps are to prepare for searching for housing and how to maintain good relationships with landlords. So please note that this is not an exhaustive list, which is why we encourage you to send an email to info@bist.ca if you discover errors or if you learn of updates to programs or new resources that we may have missed so that we can update this document periodically. So I'm Allison Fu, and I created this document with help from Colleen Worsley, who is a social worker, Laura Pisano, who works in public health, Bob Murphy, who is a very powerful advocate for the brain injury community, as well as Julie Osbelt and Kathy Halovanik. I apologize if that's not how you pronounce her name. Julie and Kathy are both ABI system navigators. Julie also works for the Toronto ABI network, which is going to be likely your first step in trying to apply for supportive housing. Kathy is also associated with Cheers. We also have an accessible version of this document available. Throughout the document, you will see the terms client versus individual. Both of these terms refer to the person with a brain injury. And if you see blue wording, that means that those resources are specific to people with brain injury. And so what you'll notice is that in this very long document, there are actually very few resources that are specific to people with brain injury. So it's very important that we think about all of the different intersectionalities that the person has in their identity to see if there are resources that they might be eligible for completely separate from their brain injury. And you'll see in green wording, and those indicate that your first step for applying for those options is to go through the Toronto ABI network. So we've provided their contact information here as well. We want to be very clear so that you have realistic expectations that the wait lists are currently very long for subsidized housing, with a minimum of 10 years at this time. You can find more information here. And unfortunately, currently, disability does not qualify people for priority groups when it comes to housing waitlist. And if you are looking for community supports or services offered in languages other than English, please see the Central Link ABI Resource Library by Neurotrauma Pathways. I'll point out right now that most of the resources are hyperlinked. So if you hold down the control key and click on that link with your mouse, it will open to the website. And the ABI waitlist is not intended for people that are just coming out of rehab. So up next, we have the table of contents. Once again, all of these are hyperlinked. Just click on the control key on your keyboard and then scroll over the item you want and then click it with the mouse. So let's say I want step 2, potential sources for funding for assistive technology. It takes me here. I'm going to go back to the table of contents. There are 6 sections of this document. The first section was really designed for practitioners that are working with people with brain injury. So for everybody else, I'm going to jump straight to section 2, which is really the main part of this document, and that's where the process map is. So there are 6 steps within section 2, and we're going to walk through each of them soon. Section 3 is our list of program funding sources and housing options specifically for children or youths. And then there's a section specifically for Indigenous peoples. And then there's a section specifically for seniors and separately for veterans. For Section 4, it's a list of resources for people with comorbid factors other than brain injury. And the last section is a summary of changes. So you can see what's been updated since the last version you had. So we're going to skip section 1 because this was designed for practitioners that have some experience going through this process map steps already. Section 2 is process map and the main part of our document. It has 6 steps. For most of the steps, there is a flow chart with yes or no questions, steps that we recommend following, and then footnotes to indicate a list of potential resources. And almost every resource in these footnotes is hyperlinked as well. So for example, if I want to open Ontario Health at Home, then I just have to hold down the control key and then put my mouse on top of that word and then click on the mouse and it'll open that website for me in a browser. Step 1 is to determine if there is an option to stay in the current housing and to obtain funding and supports accordingly. So for most of the steps in our process map, you will see a flow chart. So this was so that we could reduce the amount of writing that was in the document. But in the accessible version of this document, you will see that right under each flow chart are each of those steps written out. Here is the accessible version of this document as indicated in the title. We recommend reading it in Word format, especially if you're trying to use apps. Now, the main difference about this document is that after each flowchart image, there is a written out text version of each step in that flowchart. So it'll say accessible text version of step 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 flowchart. It corresponds to the flowchart. So for example, in the flowchart on the image here, the first question is option to stay in current housing, yes or no? And so the first step here in the text version is ask whether the individual has the option to stay in their current housing. If yes, do this, and if no, do this. And see footnote number 5. And so it reflects this flowchart process where if no, do this with this footnote number 5, and if yes, do these 2 things. The next step is to ask these questions about the level of care. So here in the second step of the written text, it says, ask whether the individual needs 24-hour care. If yes, do this. If no, do these things. And then as the last step, to ask them about whether or not they need physical accessibility. If yes, do this, and if no, do this. So this saves people from having to interpret the flowchart or from people that aren't able to see the flowchart clearly. In each of the steps within the flowchart, some of them will have footnotes. And so the footnotes are where you will find the list of resources. So for example, step 1 is asking you, does the person have the option of staying in their current housing? If yes, then we want you to concurrently complete step 3 while also obtaining funding to prevent homelessness. And so in this box, you can see footnote 1. So if we scroll down to the footnotes, number 1, you see list of resources for funding for housing and other housing related costs. So for each of these footnote sections, when there's more than one column, this is how it should be read. So you read from top down for the entire column, for the first column, and then you go back to the top of the second column, And then you again read top down. In footnote 2, we have lists of options for sources of funding for in-home support or respite care. And as you can see, we have some blue font, which indicates that these are specific to people with brain injury. As a reminder, the green font means that you should contact the Toronto ABI network to get referrals to these programs. Footnote 3 gives you a list of sources of funding for assistive technology. Footnote 4 is sources of funding for home modifications. Footnote 5 is options for immediate crisis lodging. And as you can see at the beginning of the resources, it will say pet friendly if it is. Now the last footnote here is options for short-term housing. Step 2 is about identifying all potential sources of funding for income or disability. So if you follow the flow chart, you'll see recommendations for questions you should ask yourself or options that you should look into to see if you have coverage. The first footnote is information about contacting a personal injury lawyer to fully understand your rights and risks if that's applicable to your situation. The second footnote is about potential disability insurance coverage that you may or may not have through personal policies or employment-based policies. And then footnote 3 is about government benefits, reimbursements, and rebates that you might qualify for. Footnote 4 is other potential sources of funding related to housing. So for example, we have some resources specific to people that are currently homeowners. Step 3 is about how to develop and manage a relationship between the landlord and the tenant, with tips about how to communicate with the landlords versus tips with how to communicate with the individual with brain injury. Here's the flowchart for step 3. And here are resources for mediating landlord-tenant conflict or evictions. Step 4 is the logistical planning steps for planning and preparing for the housing search. So things to keep into consideration, documents that you may need to get together for your application portfolio. Here is the flowchart for that step. And then step 5 is for actually searching for and applying for long-term housing options. Now these are broken down based on the level of care needs. So for example, if the person needs 24-hour care, then there are lists of supportive housing options in the footnotes. If they need minimal or moderate support, then there are housing options for safe housing, as well as some housing that includes minimal support or assisted living. For the first footnote, it provides you with key search terms that you might want to use to look for 24-hour care supportive housing options, with a list of some options as well. Footnote 2 is about key search areas for finding safe housing, with a few resources on how to prevent yourself from getting scammed, because there are a lot of rental scams in Toronto, unfortunately. So we want to make sure that you have information on how to avoid that. We also have lists of safe housing options, and then lists of housing service navigation resources and application portals. Now, unfortunately, to be realistic, people are having a lot of trouble finding affordable and safe or supportive housing in Toronto. So if you're not able to find something in Toronto, we do recommend looking into your options in the Greater Toronto Area or the GTA, and maybe even other cities within Ontario. So these are just a handful of examples of what your options might be outside of Toronto. So please research other areas and other programs that might be available to you in other cities. Just to start, we've given some examples of funding for housing, transitional housing options, emergency shelter options, and then going back to the top of the second column, supportive housing options, safe housing options. And once again, the blue font are those that are specific to people with brain injury. We also have some housing service navigation resources listed. And for the last step of our process map, this is to encourage you to look for other local programs and supports that might offset the costs or reimburse you for the costs of basic necessities, living costs, medical or therapy costs, so that you or the individual can allocate more money toward housing. The footnote section is about accessing personal support workers or PSWs. And then there are different types of community services, programs, or benefits to get you started with your brainstorming and searches. This section has a handful of resources for caregivers. So if you are a caregiver, we really want to encourage you to take good care of yourself. Section 3 are tables of resources and housing options specific to children and youth, and then specific to Indigenous peoples, and then specific to seniors, and then specific to veterans. And as you can see, most of them are broken down based on supportive housing options, safe housing options, funding for housing and housing-related costs, as well as government benefits, reimbursements, and rebates, and other types of community services, programs, and benefits. Section 4 is a table of resources specific to people with other comorbid factors. So for example, mental health, addiction, justice, crisis, developmental disability, diabetes, or living with HIV or AIDS. There are other comorbid factors that we have not listed here, and if you have one of those, then you might qualify for other resources or programs that are specifically designed for those other identities. So for example, autism. So here you can see for potential housing options, it's broken down by emergency shelters, short-term safe bed programs for mental health and justice crisis, transitional housing, supportive housing, safe housing, directories for more information, sources of funding for respite care or in-home support, housing service navigation resources, hubs, and application portals, and other types of community services, programs, or benefits. And on the last page, we have a table for the summary of changes so that you can see what's changed since the last version you used. We wish you the best of luck finding safe and affordable or supportive housing in Toronto soon. Thank you so much.